Welcome everyone to another lecture, Microeconomics. And the slide behind me is rather empty, but yet we have a full program today. And it's also an important lecture because we deal with externalities today. So I will guide you through and let's get started. So externalities come in many forms, and one important example of an externality is the pollution that consumption and production decisions cause. So this is an example of the level of carbon monoxide across the globe. And as you can see, there are spots in many regions where the level of carbon monoxide is very high. And surprisingly, you see that high levels are also observed in the tropical rainforest of Brazil and in parts of India and Indonesia. And this is also because a lot of wood is burned over there, which is not a good thing to happen, but the picture shows that it does happen. And there's also a link that shows you a video on YouTube that gives you an impression how the nitrogen dioxide emissions reduced during the COVID pandemic in January till March 2020. And especially in northern Italy, that makes a big difference. So pollution is a major fact of life around the world. So we can think of environmental pollution, but as the picture shows, you can also think of pollution at a more regional scale, at the level of your student flat, and also that is an externality. So if your flatmate doesn't clean up his or her stuff, then it carries a negative externality to all other flatmates. So air quality, as mentioned, is a major issue, which has important health consequences and health costs estimated to be over 100 billion a year. And still, a lot of this pollution is due to coal-fired plants. And for that reason, it's also important to have markets to reflect the true cost of using that type of fuel. Other forms of pollution are, think of the noise of your neighbors when they have a party, which may be less festive for the other people in the block. Also, if you are in the public space and the person next to you is smoking a cigarette or a cigar, then depending on your taste, that may come with a positive externality if you like the smoke of cigars and cigarettes, but mostly you will experience that as pollution because you dislike it. If you are neighbors and you own your own house and you take care of your garden, then you may feel very sad if your neighbor doesn't keep up and makes a mess of his or her garden, also causing negative externalities. Negative externalities between neighbors, of course, are famous from the comic Donald Duck, where Donald Duck always has fights with his neighbor. Important pollution and negative externalities. In sum, all these outcomes are evidence of market failures. So far, general equilibrium, the world was nice. Under certain conditions, the market reached efficient outcomes. And now we enter the space where we have externalities that make the market not to reach efficient outcomes. So markets are efficient when all transactions that positively benefit society take place, and those that don't take place, then the market is efficient. And it does so by taking all costs and benefits into account. And that encompasses both the private benefits and private cost and the social cost and benefits. And in the second term, there occurs the problem, because in many instances, private cost and benefits are taken into account in transactions, but not the social cost and benefit. So, to give an example, if you have a smoker in the park, only concerned with his enjoyment of smoking the cigarette and not to the cost imposed on other people in the park. Other example is people with a dog, also in the park. They just let the dog shit in the park, sometimes at the place where the kids play soccer. That shitting of the dog is a cost to other users of the park, notably children playing soccer. And apparently the owners of the dogs don't take that into account. They engage in this type of behavior because they do take into account the private cost of taking care of the dog's manure by having this bag with them, such that they can dispense of the poo. That is a private cost. They do take it into account. That makes them decide not to do it. And the social cost to other users of the park, they don't take into account, which leads to this unfortunate outcome. As said, efficient markets take all these additional costs into account, but it often doesn't happen. And I already mentioned one source of market failure, which are the externalities. Other source of market failures is that the nature of the good under consideration has the properties of a public good. And that is something we will go into the second part of this lecture. But first, externalities. So, a definition of externalities is that these are the costs or benefits that affect a third party that is not directly involved into an economic transaction. So externalities come into two flavors. They may be negative externalities when there is a cost that is imposed on a third party that is not part of the transaction. So it's not a direct buyer or a seller, but despite that, the person experienced a negative cost. Example here is the air pollution from coal-fired power plants. But you can also have positive externalities where a third party not directly engaged into the transaction gets a benefit. So that is good in principle. So in spring, an obvious example are the beekeepers. So the bees, they produce honey. That is something that the beekeeper may take into account. Maybe those private benefits may be the reason for him or her to keep bees. But in the bees also help with pollinating crops. They are quite vital for that. And in that sense, they generate a positive benefit to all people who don't keep bees, but who own some apple trees and other crops. So when externalities are present, either positive or negative, then the cost and benefits to the society are different from the private cost and benefits to the people involved in the transaction. So there's a gap between the two. And if the people engaged in the transaction do not properly take that into account, then we reach the wrong market outcomes. So returning to the smoker, so I don't know whom of you is a smoker, but I'm not. But I can imagine that if you like smoking, then you weigh off the benefits and cost of smoking, and the private cost of smoking are, and this is a non-exhaustive list, but first of all, the cost of purchasing cigarettes, which is a quite expensive hobby to have. Another cost is the cost of having smelly clothing. The smell of cigarettes and the smoke gets into your clothing, and often it is not a very nice smell. You also develop yellow teeth, which are not considered attractive, so a cost as well. And last but not least, if you smoke for a longer time, then your private health cost may importantly increase, because smoking is proven to be a very unhealthy hobby to have. But that's not all. On top of that, there are additional costs to society. So a first cost is the second-hand smoke health effects. So if you are near to a smoker, then you also inhale some of the smoke, which is unhealthy, but also unpleasant. And there are also health costs that the smoker, him or herself, doesn't bear, but that are borne by society. So that part of the health cost is also a social cost. And then there's the smell imposed onto non-smokers. So again, not an exhaustive list. You can think of other side consequences of smoking, but these are just a few. So what then are the economic efficiencies from externalities? Well, in practice, these are the costs that we've listed before, and we call them the external marginal cost. So the marginal costs that are private, that the transacting parties take into account, they can call the intrinsic or the internal marginal cost. But now we talk of the external marginal cost, which are all the costs that are imposed on the third party when an additional unit or good of a good is produced or consumed. You can also have an external marginal benefit if there's a benefit conferred to a third party by the production or consumption of an additional unit. As long as there are no externalities, then the benefits to society and the cost perfectly align with the private costs and benefits. So then if you just leave it to the market, if you just leave it to the private parties, they will reach an outcome that is also optimal from a social point of view. But if there's this gap between the social cost and benefits and the private cost and benefits, that doesn't longer hold true. So the social cost of an economic transaction is the sum of the private cost and the external marginal cost. And the social benefit of an economic transaction is the sum of the private benefit plus the external marginal benefit. If you have negative externalities, then there's an external cost on society. So again, considering the coal-fired power plant. The power plant produces electricity, which is beneficial to society because we need electricity and ever more of it. But in the process of producing electricity, pollutants are released into the air. So different pollutants, and some of them are mentioned here, and they impose a social cost to society. And there's a nice paper published a couple of years ago that looks at the US and at subsidies for electric vehicles. Now, if you subsidize electric vehicles, one consequence is that more electric vehicles get sold. So then you also need more electricity to power those electric vehicles. And they look at the different states who derive the benefits from these subsidies and who bears the cost. And the outcome is that in California, people benefit because there more people start driving electric vehicles. That leads to cleaner air, which is a positive benefit for the people in California. However, California is not a region where electricity is produced. Most of the electricity is produced in states such as North Dakota. And in North Dakota, not many people drive an electric vehicle, but they do have a lot of these coal-fired power plants, so they bear a lot of the social cost of the increase in electric vehicles. So what the paper shows is that the benefits, the social benefits and cost of this drive towards electric powered cars are not evenly distributed across states and people. So the pollutants, they impact the environment and indirectly also human health, which creates welfare losses that we need to take into account. And the cost of operating the plant, so the direct cost of production, they are taken into account by the firm owners. So that's good. If the costs are too high, then they will not produce. But they do not incorporate into their decision-making process the social cost. And that means that if the social costs are high, that doesn't induce the firm owners to scale down on their production. So the production will be too high in equilibrium from a societal point of view. So now we had a lot of definitions and a number of examples, and now we go to the modeling side of all this and we consider a competitive market for electricity. So graphically, getting back to what we used to, we have a supply and demand curve, and since this is a competitive market, the supply curve is just the upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve of the firms. And if we leave it to the market, then the equilibrium quantity will be Q market and the equilibrium price will be P market. Novel thing here is that the production of electricity comes with an external marginal cost. So there's a cost of producing electricity that is not incorporated into the calculations of the plants, but is part of the cost that society needs to bear. And in this example, we have a constant external marginal cost. So it's a flat yellow bar that we have. And this means that the social marginal cost of producing additional units of electricity is not given by the marginal cost curve, the red curve over here, but is the sum of the marginal cost to the firm plus the external marginal cost to society. So the societal marginal cost is equal to the sum of the red curve and the flat yellow curve. So I've depicted it here. Since this one is constant, we just increase the red supply curve by the amount of the external marginal cost in order to reach the social marginal cost. And doing so, we observe that when we incorporate the cost to society, we reach a new equilibrium at the point A, and at this market equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity is lower and the equilibrium price is higher. So, and if you compare the points A and B, then you realize that if we do not incorporate the cost to society, but only the marginal cost to the firm, then we end up at point B, and in equilibrium, too much electricity will be sold and bought. And that leads to a deadweight loss. So the externality causes a deadweight loss because at point B, some people are buying electricity who would not have bought electricity if the price of electricity would have reflected the true cost to society. So at point B, the marginal consumer is buying electricity at the market price, but the market price, the price that he pays, is much lower than the social cost of producing this final unit of electricity. And the same holds for all the units between A and B, that the social cost is higher than the social benefits. And that creates the deadweight loss equal to the pink triangle over here. So this pink triangle represents the social cost associated with reaching the competitive outcome in case an externality is present. And how large this deadweight loss is very much depends on the size of the externality. So if the external marginal cost is high, then the externality will also be large. If the external marginal cost is small, negligible, then the deadweight loss will also be small. We considered negative externalities, but we can also consider the flip side when we have positive externalities. And positive externalities in principle are good. There are benefits to society that go beyond the private benefits of consumption. But again, also here it holds that if the market doesn't take these positive externalities into account, then the market will reach an equilibrium where the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price do not reflect the socially optimal quantities and prices. So we will go over an example. So the classic example of a positive externality is education. So you will be happy to hear this, but if you educate young people, that doesn't only carry benefits to the people that you train, because they know more than they did before, and it allows them to go for a better job and they earn a higher income. But in addition to that, there are also benefits to society. So the private benefits I don't discuss. They are part of chapter 16 in the book, but we don't treat chapter 16 in this course. But I want to focus on the social benefits. So if you have educated people in your society, then overall the entrepreneurial activity in that society is higher, which gives other people without an education also the chance of getting a job, because entrepreneurs, they create jobs. And you have more technological progress in a society, which is also a benefit to all people that did not take the education. So, and you could also mention that if people become or engage in education, if young people are in school or at universities, then they're not on the street, they're not idle, so the crime rate is also likely to go down because of education. So let's do this with a figure. So on the x-axis we have the quantity of college degrees, and then on the y-axis we have the price of a college degree. So if we look at the demand for college degrees, it's the blue downward sloping demand curve, and the supply of college degrees is given by the red line, reflecting again the marginal cost curve. But as said, college degrees not only carry a private benefit, but also an external marginal benefit. And again, we assume that the marginal benefit of an additional college degree, the external marginal benefit is constant. So again, we have a flat horizontal line. And this implies that the benefits to society exceed the private benefits that are reflected in the demand curve. So the social demand for college degrees is the private demand for college degrees plus the external marginal benefits. And the reason that you have to aggregate these two to get at the social demand is that if you consider the person over here, the demand curve reflects the person's willingness to pay for a college degree, which may be €1,000 a year. But if that person attaining a college degree also comes with a benefit to society, an external benefit of say €2,000, then the individual ideally should not be willing to pay 1,000 for his college degree, but 3,000, because only if the price is higher than 3,000, then the cost exceeds the benefits to society as a whole. Okay, so I already said what is now appearing in the boxes. And what you can see here is that from the social perspective, the equilibrium quantity of college degrees should be Q star. But if we leave it to the market, that doesn't take into account these private benefit or the social benefits, then we arrive at a lower number of educated people, a lower number of college degrees. And this, of course, is the reason, and we will get to that in section 17.2, that the government gives high subsidies to university education and also the lower levels of education. Because it realizes that education, the benefits of education, exceed the private benefits and also has great benefits to society. And also here we have a deadweight loss, because if we do not regulate this market, then we will arrive at equilibrium represented by point B. And some people between Q market and Q star, in the unregulated market, they decide not to take education because the private benefits are smaller than the private cost. Although from a societal point of view, the social benefits outweigh the social cost of education. So from a social point of view, they should take the education, and the size of the deadweight loss is equal to the pink triangle given over here. And that brings us to the first quiz of today. So now for something completely different. No education, but we are going to consider leather. And leather is sold in a perfectly competitive industry, and the short-run supply curve, the marginal cost curve in this industry, is an upward sloping 3Q curve. And Q is measured in millions of leather hides per year. And the inverse demand for leather hides is given by P is 60 minus 7Q. So clearly downward sloping. And the question to you then is, find the equilibrium price and quantity sold. Again, this is what we already knew before this lesson to do, just equating supply and demand in order to get a market price and a market quantity. But question B is new. Suppose that leather tanning is a polluting activity because a lot of water is needed and the water gets very filthy. That releases chromium and other pollutants into local waterways. The external marginal cost of that is estimated to be constant at $4 for each leather hide produced. Calculate the social optimal level of output and the price for the leather tanning industry. Good luck.